And when we think about a learning system, how many of you are familiar with Peter Senge? Anybody? A few of you? Peter Senge, over 30 years ago, I actually had to look it up, I didn't realize it was so long, talked about the idea of organizations as a learning system. And he talked about the fact that we can't think about doing really important things and solving really deep problems if we just look at everything as separate initiatives, separate things in our organizations. So we can solve much deeper problems when we make those connections and get underneath the real issue. And so what I'm going to talk today about is work as a learning system. How do all those different parts come together? I'm going to share a little bit with you about some of my experiences in some of the organizations in which I've worked. And I'm going to talk about it not only at the system level, but I'm going to talk about it at two other levels. We're going to talk about it at the network level or the team level, how we can use teams to more actively and intentionally learn and connect. And then I'm going to talk about it at what I call a learning lab level. This is at the individual level. I think about work as a learning lab. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. So first, as work as a learning system, we've talked for many years about how do we integrate what we're doing as HR professionals into the business. We have to align with the business strategy. We have to make sure that culture is integrated into everything we do, but yet we kind of stop there. We don't really get into many more details of how to do that. How do we connect culture and integrate it into our everyday work? How do we make it part of the business? How do we operationalize culture? So that's what I want to talk a little bit next. So if we think about business, we think about strategy, of course, right? So we think about the what of business, and then we think about the how, the culture side. So the what and the how. And then we think about learning. I believe that that's where those two things come together. Learning and learning organizations are really the what, the strategy, and the how we work on a day-to-day basis. So let me get into that in a little more detail. So when we think about strategy, we know we all have to create a vision. When we think about culture, one of the key pieces I think about culture is values and behaviors. A lot of you have heard about values, and we've been talking about this over the last couple of days. I believe that you take a step further and really describe your actual behaviors. What do you see on a daily basis with your employees? What do you expect of them? What are you observing? And then from an objective standpoint on the strategy side, we have processes. So these are all the processes that we're familiar with, that we've rolled out. It's the feedback process, it's the development process, it's the promotional process, it's the interview process. All of these processes that we experience as employees and that we create as talent professionals are what I believe also make up culture. And then lastly, we always want results. As a business, to keep running, we have to have results. And then from a cultural standpoint, there's the practices. So the practices are more of the day-to-day kind of things that happen. So your all-hands meetings, your regular meetings. Do you encourage your managers to have one-on-ones? Your decision-making practices, what are those? So these are the things that are woven into the day-to-day, and they complement what you're doing from a process standpoint. And then from a learning standpoint, if we're creating a vision we have a vision for our organization, and we have values and behaviors, what do we then do to make sure that we're building the right skill sets around those values and behaviors? We need to be supporting those as an organization. And I'll give you an example in a minute. We need to be thinking about how to integrate those values and behaviors into everything we're doing. And then we need to make sure that we're continuing to use data on an ongoing basis, which I know a lot of you have talked about again over the last couple of days. There's a lot more data out there that we have access to now. So I'm going to give you an example of a company that I've been working with for about a year. It's a startup in Silicon Valley called Envoy. Some of you may have used it and not even known it. It's a visitor management software company. So when you go in as a visitor, you sign in, there's an iPad, and it makes it just really easy for you to now be a visitor. They do document signing and deliveries as well. But they've been around for about 4 years. When I started working with them, they were about 80 employees, and typical of Silicon Valley in the last year, they've doubled in size, so they're at about 160 employees right now. But when I started working with the CEO and head of HR, they had a set of values. They had about 4 values, but they didn't really feel like they were implemented. They didn't feel like they were integrated into the organization, and they wanted to make sure that they got all of these pieces right as they continued to grow. And so what I did is I came in, and I'm still working with them now, and you can see as we walk through here how we kind of aligned all of those things that I talked about. So from a strategy standpoint, they wanted to create, they had a vision of creating better workplaces. I'm going to go from strategy, culture, and then I'll talk about the learning piece. From a cultural standpoint, we ended up with 5 core values and some behaviors underneath there. And you're getting a handout now, so you're going to be able to do this in just a minute yourself. And they wanted to, one of those behaviors was they wanted to encourage people to experiment, because that was a core part of what the company was about. From a strategy standpoint, one of the objectives was to increase the number of experiments they had on a quarterly basis. Culturally, in order to make sure that they hired people who were good with experimenting, maybe not even good, but comfortable with experimenting, they wanted to make sure from a process standpoint that they were integrating some key behavioral questions into the interview process. So when they were starting to interview people, they had questions like, tell me about a time when you experimented. What happened? For managers that they were hiring, they would say, tell me about a time when you were experimenting with your team, or when your team failed. What happened? So it was a lot of integration of what that experimentation could look like. And then lastly, from an objective standpoint and results, they wanted 2 new business models every quarter. Very aggressive. And then from a cultural standpoint, they had what they called an all-hands meeting, which was called Show and Tell every Friday. They used those meetings to highlight experiments that happened during the week. Teams that actually experimented, and whether or not they worked out, they highlighted what they learned from that. And then from a data standpoint, they continued to get feedback data from candidates to make sure that they were having a good experience, regardless of whether or not they got hired. So that hopefully gives you an idea of what I'm talking about with these kinds of connections between strategy and culture, and how learning kind of brings it all together. And I'm not saying that this all has to be one for one. This is not a perfect mapping. Because certainly, when we think about strategy, that's something that we're probably iterating on a lot more than we are with our values and behaviors. Though we do iterate on values and behaviors, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm just giving you an example of how to think about making those connections a little tighter than I think what we do today as talent professionals.